On Wednesday, January 2nd, 1935, at around 1:20 p.m., a man calling himself Roland T Owen entered the Hotel President in Kansas City. He requested an interior room on an upper floor. He was given room 1046. Owen was described as average-looking, dark hair, white, had a cauliflower ear, and a comb-over to cover a horizontal scar on the side of his head above his ear. His age was rough to determine, with some employees saying that he was in his mid-30s and others saying he was in his early 20s. He was well-dressed, wearing a suit underneath a dark overcoat, but strangely, he had no luggage with him. Bellboy Randolph Probst guided Owen to his room on the 10th floor. When the two walked in, Randolph watched Owen reach into his coat pocket and take out a hairbrush, a comb, and toothpaste, which were the only items he had. Later that afternoon, a maid named Mary Sopdick entered room 1046 to find Owen sitting in a chair immersed in darkness, with the only light coming from a dim lamp. She says that he was interrupted by her presence, but told her to proceed with her cleaning duties. After a few minutes, he stood up, put on his coat, and told her not to lock the door because he was expecting a friend. After he left, Sopdick saw a note on the desk reading, quote, "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." She would later tell investigators, quote, "He was either worried about something or afraid. He always wanted to kind of keep in the dark." A few hours later, at 4 p.m., Sopdick returned to the room with fresh towels to once again find Owen in the dark. The next day at 10:30 in the morning, Sopdick returned to room 1046 to find that the door was locked from the outside, indicating that Owen had stepped out. Sopdick unlocked the door to find that Owen was still inside, once again sitting in the dark with only the lamp on. While she was in the room, she heard a conversation Owen had over the phone. Quote, "No, Don, I don't want to eat. I am not hungry. I just had breakfast." At 4 p.m. that day, Sopdick returned with fresh towels. As she approached the door, she heard Owen talking to another man who had a deeper, louder voice. She couldn't hear what they were saying. She knocked on the door, explaining that she had towels. The man with the deep voice said, quote, "No, we don't need any. We've got enough." Mary found this strange because she had taken all the towels earlier, so there were none in the room. At around 11 p.m. that night, a man named Robert Lane was passing near the hotel and was flagged down by a man who requested for a ride. Once he got inside, Lane noticed that the man was bleeding from his arm, a wound that looked deeply cut. The man made a comment saying that he was going to kill somebody the next day. After a few blocks, Lane dropped the man off. He would later identify Roland T Owen to be this man. That same evening, a woman staying in room next to 1046 reported hearing multiple people talking very loudly and cursing. However, there was a party going on in room 1055 with multiple people coming in and out of the 10th floor during the night. The next day on Friday, January 4th, Della Ferguson, the hotel switchboard operator, noticed that the phone was off the hook in room 1046. Bellhop Randolph Probst was sent to the room where he noticed a Do Not Disturb sign hanging on the knob. He knocked anyway and heard a deep voice say, quote, "Come in," but the door was locked. The person also told him to turn on the lights, but the door was still locked. Randolph yelled out to put the phone back on the hook, and he walked away. An hour and a half later, the phone was still off the hook. Another bellhop, Harold Pike, was sent to the room to find the sign was still on the door, and the door had been locked from the outside. Using his passkey, Pike was able to open the door, finding the room to be completely dark. With the lights from the hallway, Pike could see that Owen was lying on the bed, naked, with dark spots on the sheets. He put the phone back on the hook and left. Almost 2 hours later, the phone had come off the hook again. The original bellhop, Randolph Probst, was sent to the room again to find it locked. He knocked, then entered to find Owen in front of the door, on his knees and elbows, holding his head in his hands. Randolph turned on the light to find that Owen was bleeding from his head. There was also blood on the walls, floors, ceiling, bed, and in the bathroom. Randolph left and called the police. When the police entered, Owen was sitting on the edge of the bathroom tub with his head on the sink counter. Police noted that he had been bounded with a cord which was still wrapped around his neck, ankles, and wrists. They also noticed that somebody had been strangling him. It would be revealed that Owen had been stabbed multiple times in his chest, which had pierced his lung. He also had been hit on the head multiple times, resulting in his skull being fractured. One of the detectives asked who had been in the room with him, and Owen responded, "Nobody." The detective asked him how he got hurt, and Owen responded, "I fell against the bathtub." He He then lost consciousness and was rushed to the hospital. Doctors said his wounds were inflicted around 6 to 7 hours earlier, well before Randolph had first entered the room around 7 o'clock. Unfortunately, Roland T Owen died the next day on January 5th. When authorities searched his room, they didn't find any of Owen's clothing. They also found that the hotel's soap, shampoo, and towels were missing. What they did find was an unsmoked cigarette, a woman's hairpin, a bottle of sulfuric acid, and a clothing label that was made in New Jersey, but they didn't find any murder weapon. They dusted the room for fingerprints and found some on an unbroken glass. These fingerprints were possibly from a woman. As for finding out who Don was, authorities had nothing. They also had a problem finding anybody who knew Owen. They searched for records of a missing Roland T Owen, put his description in the newspaper, interviewed people, and published photos of him, but as days turned into weeks, there was no record of a missing Roland T Owen. Authorities concluded that he had most likely given the hotel staff a fake name. 3 months later in March, there was still no identification of Owen. It was announced in the newspaper that he was to be buried in a potter's field. Shortly after, a man would call the Melody McGilly Funeral Home, saying that he would send the money to provide Owen with a proper funeral. In the following days, money was delivered to the funeral home anonymously. Funeral flowers were also anonymously paid for, along with a card that said, quote, "Love forever, Luis." Almost 2 years later, in November 1936, a woman named Ruby Ogletree, who lived in Birmingham, Alabama, saw a newspaper article detailing the case. She would correctly identify Roland T Owen as her son, whose real name was Artemis Ogletree, and he was actually 17 years old. He had left Birmingham in April 1934. Ruby revealed that she had actually received 3 typed letters from her son, the first of which she had received in the spring of 1935, months after he had already died. The letters were also suspect because, according to Ruby, Artemis didn't know how to type. It was also revealed that while Artemis was in Kansas City, he had stayed in the St. Regis Hotel with another man, possibly Don. Sometime in the early 2000s, author John Horner, who published an account of the murder case, received a call from an anonymous person. This person claimed to have been searching through a recently deceased elderly person's box. In the box, they found multiple newspaper clippings about the Owens case. They had also found an item that had been mentioned by the newspapers in the box. However, this person didn't reveal what it was and hung up. This is where the case seemingly ends, so with all of that, let's get into the theories. Our first theory is that Artemis was murdered by Don. With Artemis referring to a man named Don several times, and the maid Mary Soapdick hearing another man's voice through the door, it makes sense to assume that this man, Don, was the one who had killed Artemis. With the police finding multiple feminine items in the room after Artemis's death, it should be assumed that a woman was also present and in some part involved in the murder. In fact, an elevator operator named Charles Blotcher, who was working the night shift on January 3rd, the night of the big party in room 1055, had taken a commercial woman to the 10th floor, where she was meeting a man in room 1026. However, the man was not in the room, even though he told her to meet him there. She would then leave the hotel and return with a man about an hour later, and they went to the 9th floor. Around 4:15 a.m., the woman would come down from the 9th floor and leave. 15 minutes later, the man did the same thing. Many point to these two being the woman who was in the room and the unknown Don. However, I find this unlikely. However, there are no leads or suspects about who Don really is. Our second theory is that Artemis was killed for cheating on his girl. Let's look back to when the anonymous man called the funeral home saying that he would send money for a proper burial. According to a Kansas City newspaper, the man who called said other things. Quote, "I want you to bury him in Memorial Park Cemetery. Then he will be near my sister. I'll send money for the funeral expenses." He would then go on to explain that Artemis had jilted a girl who he planned to marry. The caller had watched this unfold, and the three had a, quote, "little meeting" in the hotel room. He ended by saying, "Cheaters usually get what's coming to them." Around this time, a woman called the newspaper's editorial room saying, quote, "You have a story in your paper that is wrong. Ronald Owen will not be buried in a pauper's grave." The staff member asked, "Who are you? Who's calling?" "Never mind, I know what I'm talking about." He got into a jam. Then she hung up. The flower company received a call requesting for flowers to be sent to Artemis's funeral. The caller said, quote, I'm doing this for my sister. If all these reports are true, they seem to suggest that Artemis had cheated on the man's sister who had killed him. The man's sister was most likely named Louise, since that was the name on the card. However, the problem with this theory is that these calls may have been fabricated, being that only the newspaper seemed to have reported these major details. However, even if they aren't true, this theory would explain why Artemis had refused to give up his killer when he was interviewed by detectives. It would also explain why the person who had killed him was seemingly the one who paid for the funeral and had put the name Louise on the card sent with the roses.